Thank you, thank you, thank you. But it is lovely to be here with you. Actually, I came to Swellendam for the first time in December, even though I grew up in Cape Town and have lived here my whole life. I've never been here in this beautiful, beautiful little town. And when I came here, I was so impacted by the beauty of Swellendam, where I'm sure most of you felt that way, that you just want to stay and hope someone adopts you and takes you in and, you know, feeds you and clothes you and gives you a home. Anyone, any volunteers? No, I'm just kidding. But my husband's family are also from Swellendam, and they actually are buried here and they have a long history here. So it became kind of a historical kind of moment for us both, in that we visited and then we're like, oh, we have ancestors here. And so that was quite cool, and going to the Drosti and looking through some of the manuscripts. His ancestors are in those manuscripts. So I think that that makes it so wonderful, and everything just comes alive. My lifelong fascination with Lady Anne Barnard also brings Swellendam to life, as I'm sure many of you know. And her obviously sleeping in one of these art buildings when she visited is quite special, that we're sitting here this evening. But the main reason, we both forgot the PowerPoint. This is going to be an interesting one. This picture is a bit sketchy because I took it off a video that I recorded when I visited in December. Now, I must tell you, when I visited, what intrigued me was when I went to the Drosti Museum, obviously. I met a lovely guide at the entrance at the Drosti, and she told me that when you visit the old jail, there is that cell, you know, the solitary confinement cell where women stayed. And she told me a bit about this, that of course there's, you know, the cell women were there instead of getting flogged or whipped or anything like that. But she told me something that you should never tell someone that has worked with women abuse or someone that is big about empowering people, is that she told me that women who were disobedient to their husbands were imprisoned in this cell.
Wow.
Now, yeah, exactly. yeah, I'm sure there's probably some people that want to sign up for that, you know, when can I get my wife placed in there, you know, I'll pay. You know, but I was very anxious about this reality and thought, if women were put into this cell for being disobedient, how do we define disobedience? How do we define that word? Is there a way that we can? You know, she burnt the supper, or she didn't have the supper ready. And I thought about my own mom, who got in trouble from my dad because she burnt the supper. And so having a strong heart for women abuse is because I witnessed abuse when I grew up. And I kind of had this heart to say, what does this really mean? And how could a man, my husband said to me, how can a man bring his wife here and leave her here in the cell for doing what? What would be the cause for that? But I am very pleased to announce and to say that after 5 months of very deep archival work, every single week for 5 months, deep in the archives, there is no historical or archival records of any woman being held in the cell for being disobedient to their husband. And I'm very big about the fact that history is revealed through not just the stories we tell, but through the actual material that we have. If we are going to try somebody and put them in a jail, there has to be a law that tries you for that particular thing. No law, if you go back, existed to try a woman for disobedience. So yes, women were tried for disobedience. We're going to get into that this evening, but not to their husbands, to a very, very other different form of disobedience. So we can all breathe easy. If you're feeling disappointed, the men in the room, I'm sorry, we can talk about it outside later on. But women, I think that the story was women were there for disobedience, but not to their husbands. And so maybe the story, you know how myth goes after 200 years, it evolves, and then there becomes these great tales that aren't really so true. So while women were held there, it wasn't because there was a husband problem. There were other problems. And what I'm going to share with you this evening is I'm incredibly passionate about women's history. And for anybody who loves history, I want you to, and you probably do this often, go down to a bookshop and browse the history section, or what we call the Afrikaner section in any bookshop. And I want you to number how many books are there that are written about female history figures. And you will find that 30% are about women and 70% are about men. And that's fine. We're not saying that men shouldn't be written about. It's just that women's stories haven't been told because we haven't really discovered them, not because they weren't there, but because they haven't been a priority. And we are discovering that when we make women a priority, we reveal a deeper form of life than what we ever thought before. And so it's very, very interesting. So when we get into the Drosti, obviously, as many of you know, and I'm sharing this for those who don't know, obviously back home in Cape Town as well, who are interested in this topic, that the Drosti was built obviously in 1747, the residence and headquarters for the magistrate. The jail was built on, the home for the secretary, the mill and the beautiful outbuildings. And the first magistrate, obviously, Johannes Theophilus Renus, and he was assisted by a board of councillors, the secretary, whose handwriting, I just want to say, there was numerous secretaries whose handwriting really sucks. I don't really know how they chose the secretary, but it wasn't based on handwriting, because if you go to the archives and try and make out what that guy was writing, it was just atrocious. But there was a number of slaves here, and we know that the Drosti was solved in 1846. So they had a 99-year history. But essentially, there were a lot of people that came through this Drosti before I get into the slavery. It's hard to believe, actually, because I actually also thought it was much longer.
Yeah.
But it had a 99-year kind of history. One of the things that I was asked was how many women were held in this old jail here in the Drosti. This evening I'm only going to tell you about 13. And when I told Philip about that, he was like, that many? You know, I was like, that little that we're going to talk about this evening. There were so many more. But I also wanted to also tell you one or two interesting stories away from this. I want to add that there was something I didn't think that I would have to go deeply into when I began to look at the old jail. And that was slavery. It's a very, very interesting topic. It's also a very controversial topic. It's also a very sensitive topic. And it's also a topic that I just don't feel that we need to get deeply into this evening. One of the things that we didn't mention this evening is my involvement with the Cape Town Museum. I'm the chairperson of the Friends of the Cape Town Museum, and I was commissioned for a full-length Women's Month exhibition for the new Cape Town Museum that's actually opening next month. And one of the things I had to look at again was slavery and that reality, and I never thought that I'd have to do it for the old jail. When I visited Swellendam in December, when I walked into the old jail, I really had a sense that there were women there that wanted their names to be remembered and their stories to be remembered. And as I tell you their stories today, I know it's very easy for us to judge people based on a criminal record, but remember that archival records are basically criminal records, and that's what we're looking at. But we're looking at one moment in one person's life. Remember that there's so much more than the time that they spent in solitary confinement. There's so much more than the moment that we meet them in the archives. There's so much more. And sometimes we judge them and go, oh, well, look at what they did. Or maybe we judge the people that put them there. And we say, oh, look at what they did. But I don't know about you, but sometimes I get upset with the people that, I work with, the employees or the people that clean my house, or I kind of like get angry and irritated, and I think like if I lived 200 years ago, would I also be complaining about them? Maybe I would. So the same level of judgment that we use to judge people in history is then we have to turn on ourselves and say, would I do something similar if that was me? It's easy to judge someone who put someone else in jail, but we don't know if we would have done the same thing if we lived all those years ago, or what our response would be. So my response to history people or historical figures is, how can I judge them if I'm not sure if I would have done the same? If my response to what they experienced would have been exactly the same. I don't know if I can say that I wouldn't have taken someone to the Landros for being a disobedient slave. I don't know if I wouldn't have. Maybe I would have. So that's one of the things that I want to say before we get into looking at slavery. I think this is very important. A lot of people don't know the timeline. And my focus this evening is just the second British rule period. But I want to give you this. In 1652, we obviously know that's when apparently everything went downhill. And so the refreshment station was started. 1666, we know slaves built the castle in Cape Town. 1693, slaves outnumbered free people in the Cape, which is pretty interesting, right? 1795, we know the British take control of the Cape. In 1796, British outlawed torture and some of the most brutal forms of capital punishment that were used against slaves. That was a big moment for the Cape. In 1807, the British government outlawed the slave trade altogether. You could still own slaves, but you couldn't buy or sell a slave. This was called the Slave Trade Act of 1807. This was a very important moment because this began to upset a lot of people living in the Cape. And this is where people also start getting uncomfortable because yes, maybe you or my ancestors were upset about the fact that they couldn't buy and sell slaves anymore. And that was just a reality. We also know that there was a slave rebellion that rose up in the Cape, but it was squashed really, really quickly and didn't really amount to much. 1826, and this is going to be part of where our focus is this evening because I had to narrow it down to figure out whose stories I was going to tell you because there are so many. The British introduced laws to render punishment less cruel, and we have official slave protectors who were appointed in different districts. The thing about the slave protectors is that they had a very difficult job. They actually had to visit the farms. And in Swellendam, there were 600 slave owners during this period. So they had to visit all the farms and they had to see everything that was going on. The British also introduced a law that said that if you owned slaves, you had to keep a punishment book. So every time you punished a slave, you had to write it in the book. And then this guy would have to look through your book and see if you were punishing your slave too much, what was happening, what kind of punishment. So the laws began to kind of feel to the people like it was infringing on their right to treat other people the way that they felt that they wanted to treat them. And again, like I said, I don't know what we would have done if we were in the same position. When slavery was abolished in 1834, and remember it was officially December 1st, 1838, because slaves had to stay on and undergo a 4-year apprenticeship to make them fit for slavery, to not be a slave anymore. At this time, there were 38,000 slaves. And remember, I just told you there were only 600 slave owners in Swellendam. This is a huge number, this amount of how many slaves there were just in the Cape Colony alone. And those that were born into slavery at the Cape were called van der Kaap. So if you find in the archives or you read a book and it has that name, it means that they were born here as a slave. Also the value, and this is part of why people started getting upset. The value of the slaves totaled £3 million, and that's a lot of money even today. But the British government paid out only £1 million for 38,000 slaves. It also meant there was this fee, so that had to come off because the funds had to move, and it wasn't like a Western Union transfer. It was like the money actually had to physically get on a boat and come here. And so they were compensated, but people were angry. It's like, I spent all this money to acquire these slaves, I'm only getting a little bit back. So there was a lot of animosity that started going along with it. Personally, I think that one of the most amazing historical people is William Wilberforce, who we know started the abolitionist movement in the UK, and one of the women who worked alongside him, who was actually doing anti-slave work before him, was Hannah More. And they worked so hard to actually institute these laws and to bring about the change that we saw in the Cape. But again, we saw that people, in the colonies of the British Empire weren't exactly excited about the fact that they couldn't have slaves anymore. And it was interesting. And one of the people we're going to touch on this evening, a little bit later on, trekked out of Swellendam to 18August, to Grahamstown, to Natal, because there was a problem with the fact that I can't own slaves and I can't treat my slaves as I want to. This is a problem for me. But we're going to look at him and his wife later on. So the big question is woman in the dark hole. Now it really is a dark hole. It really is that confinement cell. There's not a lot of light in there. And who were they? Now, I find these ladies are quite interesting. On the 1st of December in 1828, there was a slave named Dappet. Not Dappet, was not a female. But there were two women with him, Rachel and Annelie. And I just want you to imagine, they tried to steal 15 heads of cattle in the middle of the night. You know, like, where are they going to hide this cattle? Like, 5 cows, 5 bulls, 5 oxen. That's like crazy. Think about it. You're a slave, now you've gone over to the other person's field and you're going to steal this guy 15 heads of cattle. And that's a lot of cattle even for me to hide in my garden today. You know, someone's going to notice. Now, Rachel, how do we know about her? She was the slave of a man named Piet de Toy. Maybe, you know, some of your ancestors sitting here. And old Piet had over 30 slaves, you know, so he was quite bothered by Rachel. And Annelie was the slave of a man named Piet van der Merwe. And he was also very bothered by what happened. So they were obviously caught, Dappet, Rachel and Annelie. Dappet gets flogged, obviously at the whipping post, quite severely. But it is true that the woman got placed in solitary confinement. They were sentenced to 6 months in jail for stealing. That's actually quite a low sentence. Like today, if you're caught stealing, you get like 10 years. I studied criminology, so I had to read all that stuff. So they only got 6 months, which isn't, in my opinion, it's not too bad. But 1 month was spent in solitary confinement. And it states in the archives that when you're in solitary, that you have a sparse diet. So you only get bread and water. That is all you get for a whole month. And I kind of think of things like I'm in the, you know, that's horrible cell there. A diet of bread and water really plays havoc on your stomach. Where do you go to the bathroom? You have like a bucket. It's not a very good system. But again, that's what they decided to do. So it's interesting that we have Rachel or Rachel and Annelie. But on April 24th, 1828, a slave named Florentina, who belonged to a man named M.J. Botha, complained of mistreatment for her and her child. The magistrate heard this case and decided that the evidence was at variance. What does that mean? So Florentina brought a few eyewitnesses in and said that her master was mean to her and her child. These stories are actually quite difficult to read because you hear of things that happen. You hear of her child frequently wetting its bed because of fear. You hear of her child not being able to speak because she doesn't want to speak. You also hear that Florentina brings in a lot of witnesses, but the magistrate decides that there's nothing wrong here. And instead, she is sentenced to solitary confinement and on a diet of bread and water. One of the things that I find very difficult is that these women were sentenced to solitary along with their children. Anybody who knows anything about living conditions in any kind of jail cell where your child is, that's a very difficult situation. She has to keep a child alive with her on a diet of bread and water in the dark hole because she dared to complain against her master. And I think we've got to let that settle a bit. So she actually, you know, she was actually quite interesting, Florentina, because I was able to track her a bit more in the archives. And that's actually very difficult. She actually had a number of children. And eventually, 4 years after this, her master obviously decided he didn't want her anymore. So he sold her to a man who lived in Somerset. And then she was gone with her children. And there she disappears and you can't really find her again. The next one is Tina. Now, Tina was a slave in the ownership of a man named Johannes Everett de Jager. And she complained that there was a deficiency of food and water, that he didn't feed her correctly, because that was part of what he had to do. and that she was flogged by another master when she was hired out to work. So this could happen as well. You could hire out your slave to someone else. While they were there, that master obviously did what they wanted. Evidence was presented by 3 slaves. Their testimonies contradicted one another. The complaint was seen as unfounded. And again, Tina is sentenced to solitary confinement in that dark hole just across the road from where we are standing for 3 days. And this is 1828, 10 years before slavery was officially abolished. What we know about Tina was, at the time, she was 22 years old. She was a housemaid. She was first owned by Peter de Jager Sr., the father of this man, and he gave Tina to his son, and she complained that he didn't look after her very well, but nothing was done about it. She was sentenced to the jail. I wanted to put this in here because it says on the walls of that cell across there that women, instead of being flogged, they were placed in solitary, which isn't exactly the truth. Because sometimes women were flogged, but it was only under severe cases. In September 1822, Sarki and Clara Lina were sentenced to jail for burglary and theft. Both of them. They were both publicly scourged. In other words, they were whipped at the whipping post, and they labored in irons for 12 months. That's a bit heavy, I kind of think. And Sarki, it's beautiful because Sarki is described, and so is Clara Lina. Sarki was described as being 5'4", which is my height. She was quite small. And the archives describe her, the magistrate describes her as being light grey skin, whatever that means. And Clara Lina was 4'10", so she was a little bit smaller than me. And it says that she was very black. That's what it says in the archives. But I also think it's very brave for very small people to be stealing and theft and committing burglary crimes. Because you're not very strong when you're kind of small. I'm just putting that out there just so we know.
You can get through the burglar bars easily.
Yes, we can get through those. Yeah, definitely. But I don't know about carrying away that cattle. I think it's going to be a struggle. Janneke Pretorius, another Rachel and Amelia were sentenced on the 14th of April 1828 for also stealing cattle. I love that these ladies are so courageous. But they were unfortunately caught, and they spent 6 months in prison, 1 week each month in solitary. So it was that rotation. And this is what actually the laws said a lot. If it was 6 months, 1 week each month, so 6 weeks in total, which is actually, it's a very long time. Again, even though it's not mentioned, this is bread and water. Janneke Pretorius actually went on to murder her husband. And she's actually very interesting. It says that Janneke Pretorius, and I want you to think about something here, slaves didn't have last names. So Janneke is an interesting one. Just putting it out there. But she stabbed her husband, and it says that he died. But in her testimony, she says that she stabbed him in the groin, and he didn't have clothes on. So I'm also going to put it out there that there was a reason why, perhaps. Why was he so close to her? How did she manage to stab him in the groin? What was happening in that situation? Unfortunately, Janneke was sentenced. She did go to jail. And when we look at domestic violence, this evening I'm also going to share with you the very earliest case of domestic violence that was ever reported in Swellendam. I found it in the archives, and it's an incredible find. So there was a lady named Berkie with her 3 children, was sent to prison again for sheep stealing. They were all given the same sentence, 2 months in prison, the first 14 days in solitary confinement. She's going to jail with her children, which is, again, interesting. Now this one is incredibly interesting. This lady's name is Sal Swat, was tried by the Landros on the 4th of September 1827. The archives say this word, I don't really like it. She was tried for whoredom. She was a prostitute here in Swellendam. And she spent 14 days in solitary confinement. So it wasn't just slaves that were in this cell. Prostitution, even though we know it was happening, was actually seen as a crime. And she was sentenced for being a prostitute. And she spent time in that cell. Slave Carbus was caught for committing theft and again stealing on the 12th of January 1827, confined to 14 days in solitary on bread and water. I want to say that, you know, we see a lot of theft happening throughout the archives and a lot of people going to jail for theft. And people say, well, obviously there was stealing because these people were poor and maybe they didn't have food and maybe they didn't have enough. But the professor of history at UWC actually says that he believes that theft was a form of resistance. It was a form of slave resistance, of course, against what was happening. So the theft wasn't so much about I don't have, it was as much about I don't want to be in this situation. There were so many laws that governed theft under the British government. It almost seemed as though there was an incredible fear of things being stolen. So it was almost as though slaves could have used this way of thinking to say, we're actually standing up against our slavery by stealing from those who are seen as oppressing us. And I'm just going to leave it out there and you can make up your own mind about that. Was it a form of resistance? Because I don't see that it was something that I don't, you know, like I don't have enough, so I need to steal 15 heads of cattle. No one's going to steal 15 heads of cattle because they don't have enough. What is the message that's being sent if I say, I'm going to go and I'm going to do that? I'm going to take what I don't even need, but I'm going to take it from you. It's interesting to think about. This is a very, very interesting case, and it's very unique and it's very unusual. There was a slave named Candace, and she was employed in the kitchen of her mistress, who was a widow. The lady's name was Mrs. Jobert. Now, Mrs. Jobert had a daughter named Anna Maria, and one afternoon, Anna Maria beat Candace badly in a fit of anger. And I purposefully left the rest of the story out just so I can tell it to you without you reading it. But Candace found the courage to approach the Landros. She came here, right here, and she said, this lady beat me. I work for Mrs. Jobert. I love working for Mrs. Jobert, but her daughter beat me so badly that I have all these injuries. It wasn't a case of just presenting yourself there and someone would believe you. That's exactly how it is today. There was a district surgeon that came in, examined your body, looked at if you had wounds. It was seen that Candace had wounds. And you know what? There was this huge sign of injury in her body. And so the daughter, Anna Maria, was actually fined and sentenced. It's a very unique case, and it's very, very interesting. She was fined a huge sum of money for beating Candace, £100. £100 200 years ago was a lot of money. Usually it's about £10. But it was like the Landros that day, he was not playing games. He fined Anna Maria £100, or if she didn't pay, she had to spend 6 days in solitary confinement. To this day, I have no idea whether she paid the money or not, but it seems that she did pay the money. What's interesting is that Candace remained in the service of Mrs. Jobert for the rest of her life. She had 5 children while she was there. So it would seem that Candace wasn't actually upset with Mrs. Jobert in any way, but she was rightfully taking a case that had been inflicted upon her to the Landros and said, I don't like the way I'm being treated, help me, I still want to do my work well, I still want to stay with Mrs. Jobert, but I need you to assist me in what's happening. Because ultimately, the daughter had no right to hit her or treat her the way that she did. I find this also very interesting, and this is Mrs. W. Oudendal was sentenced to solitary confinement for a month for committing adultery. That's going to be scary. We need quite a lot of those cells around today, I would say. Too many people, including celebrities. But she was sentenced to serve this time in prison, and I find that sad, with her 2 children. We don't know why her children were placed in solitary with her. I mean, she was committing the adultery, not her children. But this was just the way that it unfortunately worked out. And you see cases of women who committed adultery. Don't you find it interesting that she's in the jail for committing adultery? Kind of like in the Bible, and I'm a theologian full time. Women have to drink a bitter mixture to see if they've committed adultery, and then their bellies swell to see if they're guilty, and then they get stoned. It's part of this whole system that we inherit. I would like to know if the person she was committing adultery with also got served, but unfortunately he didn't. Something to think about. It's just interesting to think about. Female slave Becky and her 2 children, Anna and Pete, were also caught in the field stealing by Maria X. And I wanted to tell her story, Maria. She is fascinating, but we don't have time this evening. On the 28th of December 1826 for stealing sheep, and they were sentenced to 2 months in prison, the first 14 days in solitary confinement, and then the last 14 days. Why don't they just say put them a month in solitary? I mean, it's the first 14 and the last. So basically half of their sentence was spent in solitary. I like to imagine, you know, Becky and her 2 children kind of lying in the field, kind of waiting. It's after Christmas and the merriment is all around, and they're kind of waiting to steal cattle, you know. And it's actually really interesting that her and her children went and did this. Again, is it this way of saying we don't like how we're living? We're resisting against what's happening? It's so interesting and fascinating to think about. Delphina complained against her master, and her complaint was considered unfounded. She was sentenced for 8 days to solitary confinement. I can give you so many cases like that. Another slave, Francina, brought a complaint against her master and spent much time in solitary confinement. I think that when we go into a space, it can sometimes, when we walk into this cell that we see just across the road, it can seem so unnecessary to know who was in that cell. It can seem so unnecessary to know why they were in that cell. But when we begin to uncover the stories, we begin to see deeper realities of truth, of a society, when we know who was in that space. When we know, hey, maybe I'm uncomfortable about what Betty and her 2 children did. You know, maybe I'm uncomfortable about what they did. Or maybe I don't feel like they should have been sentenced that. It helps us be able to ask questions of ourselves. And it helps us be able to understand what people were thinking during that time. And more importantly, it also helps us understand how people were treated, and how women were treated, and how children were treated. And when we look at it, I would love to see, you know, more information in the Drosti of these women and why they were there. Because I think that would make it more meaningful to us. These are the only stories that I can share with you this evening, because I literally, actually, based on the time that Alf gave me, only have 10 minutes left to speak to you. Can you believe it? So those are all the stories I'm going to tell you about the dark hole. But I really need to tell you about this one story, and it's really fascinating. Rosina, I call her the slave with feist. You know, her story starts here in Swellendam and it evolves, and that's really cool. I want to tell you this story. In the spring of 1828, there was this young pregnant slave woman. She was about 31 years old. She walked to the Drosti. She stood waiting to see the land dross. She stood waiting just here. She said and reported that her master at the time, Petrus Johannes de Toy, I told you about him earlier on, old Piet de Toy with all his slaves. This was his son. He was one of the wealthiest farmers in this whole entire town, and she said that he had hit her. The case moved very, very quickly. There was no back and forwards, no further testimonies, no multiple slaves coming in saying Rosina was right, no district surgeon visits, nothing. It moved so quickly. He didn't seem to care. He was like, I'm not even going to defend myself. He was found guilty and he paid the fine. Now I want to pause here and say that there are cases, many, many cases in Cape Town where slaves can go, oh, they probably didn't care. They did care. Your reputation as a slave owner was a big deal for you, and you had to keep it clean. So sometimes if a slave complained against their owner, oftentimes their owner would actually just release them and would give them their freedom. There are some cases like that. When the owner gets fined, they go, you know what, let's take this all off the books, forget about the fine, slave, set free, go and live your life. Just, you know, you're trying to protect your reputation, because this is a small community. Even though we have thousands of people, it's still a very small society. People are going to know, oh, Philip was caught beating his slave. sure, that's a bad guy. Like, we don't want anything to do with him because there's a mark against his name. That's how it became. Believe it or not, even though we think there was this brutality, yes, there was, and punishment was bad, but slave owners cared about what other people thought of them. And especially determined how wealthy you are, you know, your culture, what you were involved in. But this guy, he didn't really seem to even care. He was just like, okay, I hit Rosina, she took me to court, here's the fine, let's get on with it. You know, it was quite an interesting one, it moved really quickly. Rosina went back home and she worked for him, and then she gave birth to her second son. She already had a son while working there. A few months later, on the 20th of January, 1829, so just a few months later. But I didn't put the rest on here because I wanted to tell you the story myself. 18 months later, old Petrus decided Rosina was a bit too much for him. You know, she's a bit feisty and she doesn't want to do her work. So he sold Rosina to someone who probably needs little introduction. If you know anything about Voortrekker history, or you know anything about the history of the Cape, Petrus Lafras Ace, who a lot of people obviously know and think about still today. So Rosina got sold to Petrus, or Piet Ace as we say, on the 14th of May in 1830. And it's interesting that Rosina was actually the only slave that Piet Ace ever owned. He wasn't a big slave owner. He wasn't big about, you know, keeping lots of slaves. He was, you know, he had Rosina, and then he also bought her children. Remember, she had 2 children at this time. She would go on to have another 3 we don't know who the fathers are, because I don't know if you know this, but it's very interesting. One of the only rights that women had from 1805 was that you do not need to actually write down the name of the father of your child when you register your child. So in 1805, women were granted the freedom to say, hey, I'm registering my child on their birth certificate. It doesn't have to be a father's name, because if I don't want to tell my child who the father is, that's my legal right. So it was kind of seen as like an empowerment law. So Rosina was sold to Ace, and all her children were born in slavery. That is a real picture of the man himself. He needs little introduction, like I say, especially to anyone who is interested in Voortrekker history, and I want to tread quite lightly with him, because I think him and his family are very, very interesting, and to many he is seen as a hero. And we know that his father was Koos Babel Ace, and they'd moved from obviously Stellenbosch, Swellendam, eventually to Humansdorp near 18August with Piet himself. This is what was said about Piet Ace. He was said to be a stocky, short man, striking blue eyes, intelligent. Even though he had received no formal education, he was well-spoken and quiet and brave, religious and worldly wise, and all those wonderful things, and also said, though, to be very quick-tempered. We also know that he was actually friends with many of the British governors, which was also created a little bit of, you know. He became also one of the youngest leaders of the Trek, one of the youngest leaders of the Boer leaders at the time. But Rosina became a problem to Piet Ace too. She started as a problem, yeah, and she continued to be slightly a bit of a problem to wherever, you know, she kind of went. Rosina was in the service of Piet Ace's wife, who was actually Piet Ace's cousin, that he had married his cousin, Alida Maria. And it was, like I said, the only slave that they had. So Rosina had to do a lot of work, apparently according to her, and Rosina became a problem. And the reason I want to bring this up this evening is because the Rosina reality for the Ace family became a huge big deal, and became almost a blot on the family that they tried to get rid of, and I'm going to tell you why. Because Piet Ace harbored quite a bit of resentment towards the British government for what they were doing regarding slaves, which is interesting, because Piet himself owned 1 slave and her few children. He wasn't a big slave owner, but he became a mouthpiece and a voice, because he was such a strong, brilliant leader for the people who had issues about the slave laws. People wanted to be able to farm their land and do with their workers what they wanted to do. And there were all these laws, and it became a thing where slaves started saying to their owners, you can't tell me to do that, because in 4 years' time I'm going to be free. And there are actual records of this in the archives where slaves go, I don't need to work and stuff because it's 1834 and by like 1838 I'm going to be out of here, so I don't need to do anything. And there's nothing you can do about it because I'm protected. So there are these realities, like people that go to the CCMA today, you know, like, don't fire me, I'm going to take you to the CCMA. It's kind of similar. But Ace became this spokesperson, and things really started heating up, and he had a big problem with how slaves were treated. So what happened was, Alida, his wife, eventually went to the magistrate's court out in PE because they had moved out from here. And she laid a complaint against another slave who had done some temporary work for her. Wasn't owned by her, but this slave had done some temporary work. And Alida herself said that this slave said that I can't punish her or discipline her when she doesn't do my work, and I have a problem with that. So Alida and Pitt had major problems with how they could treat slaves, and things really started to heat up. So on the 5th of September in 1835, Pitt took Rosina, his only slave, to court. So Pitt is now taking his slave to court, and he said that Rosina had run away. And running away as a slave was seen as a massive big deal, and it was punishable with the highest level of punishment. You can't just run away from the place where you work. So she countered this claim, Rosina, and said, actually, this is what happened. I want to show you a picture of, there's Alida Maria, and Pitt Ace's wife. This is on the Voortrekker Monument, obviously. And Rosina said that Alida Ace frequently strangles her, beats her, mistreats her, and I just want to say that they're standing with the Bible in their hands. And this was seen, the religious reality of their lives was seen as a big deal as well. And they were very religious, righteous people. And so when someone comes along and says, she's strangling me, she's beating me, she's mistreating me, it becomes a big deal. But this happened at the very right time, because there were some among the British settlers that didn't like Pitt Ace. And so obviously it now is like, hey, we're going to pull Rosina in, because she's complaining that these people are actually bad, and they're pretending to be good, and we're going to take the case a bit further, and we're going to push it, and we're going to push it. And that's what actually happened. So Rosina said the following, and this is in the archives, that Alida gives her work which she could not finish, and when she does not finish on time, Mrs. Ace strangles her. She has strangled her multiple times, and that is why she runs away. She also said that Pitt Ace is not who people think that he is, but actually he strangles her as well, only because she doesn't bring him fresh water in the morning, or does not greet him by saying good morning, and then he strangles her. It's a very interesting story. And now it's like, yes, we're going to use this story against him. So Rosina brought along a witness, an eyewitness, who was another slave named Carolina. Carolina worked for Quirvis Ace, who was a family member. And Pitt denied the claims, but Rosina declared, I'm telling the truth. So the judge at the time really didn't like Pitt Ace or his wife. So he said, okay, Rosina actually has to be given a sentence for running away. The case is still going to move forward. We're still going to see if Pitt is guilty or Alida is guilty. But, you know, Rosina needs to be put in irons for 10 days. That was what you got when you ran away. But actually, you know what we're going to do? We're going to investigate the matter, and Rosina is going to be placed in a place of comfort, away from the Ace family, so that she can be safe. And her sentence, we're going to nullify her 10 days laboring in iron sentence. We're going to keep her safe somewhere, and then we're going to investigate the matter further. This was a very specific judge, and I don't have that much time to tell you the story, but he was a very specific judge, and he really was not a fan of the Ace family. And it became a huge big deal. So the case unfolded, and there were letters sent back and forth. And actually the case then developed against Alida, Pitt's wife. Now, I must say, Pitt and his wife, people said, were like one. When you saw one, you saw the other. They were always together. They did everything together. They had this loving relationship. But Pitt obviously went on commando a lot. You know, he fought in many of the Kosa wars that we know about. And he, at the time, was on commando. And he was fighting a very, very bloody warfare that the British government had sent him to fight. It wasn't that he was going out there fighting for anybody else. They sent him out there. During that time, a constable was sent to his house in 18August. 18August. And there was a warrant of arrest out for a leader. And the warrant was given because they said suddenly that Rosina is telling the truth. The slave is in the right. A leader is going to be arrested. This is a big deal for a husband and wife that are really close. And that's like family name is now up for grabs. So a leader gets arrested and the constable leads her away. Her father-in-law, Koos Babel Ace, is a very old man at this time. He says he will go with her. You know, it was a very strong family. And suddenly someone gets over to Pitt, who is fighting like hours away, and says, your wife is being led to Port Elizabeth from 18August with a warrant of arrest, and she's going to be put in jail. And Pitt kind of like is like beside himself, and apparently he rides so fast on his horse that he reaches her in 2 hours, and it says that together they appeared before the magistrate. And this thing got wild because Pitt was so angry and said like, how can you arrest my wife? And this whole thing, and that whole manhood that's like, just leave my wife alone. And Koos Babel Ace is like really angry, and the magistrate looks at the evidence and says, well, actually, there's nothing wrong here, and Alida Maria Ace was tricked all the way, excuse the pun, she was tricked all the way for nothing because they just dropped the case. And Rosina was suddenly arrested, and Rosina was suddenly placed in jail for perjury. This problem, however, became a big thing for Pitt Ace and his family, because Rosina was someone, I think it would be interesting to find her ancestors today and just kind of figure out what they thought about her, because she kind of just really was someone that was very feisty, and obviously she had got it right here in Swellendam against her master, but she didn't get it right there. So what happened was actually Pitt Ace and them, we know that they trekked out of 18August and then went up into Natal. But before he did that, he went to get his compensation money, released Rosina and her children, and he was paid £150 for Rosina, and her children had a total value of £144. But the compensation was actually £100 less than what he should have got. But he was like, I don't want anything to do with the slave stuff anymore. I'm leaving the slaves behind. When they trekked out of Natal, when they trekked to Natal out of 18August, we know that Pitt Ace and those who left with him didn't take any slaves with them, because they weren't big about slaves, but also I think they just had enough of what had happened. But the last thing that's very interesting about this is that when Pitt Ace died, and he died just a few short years after trekking out, his wife was a widow in Natal. She remarried, but there was a man that was going to visit her, and his name was Gideon Jobert. And he was a man that was just going to go and visit her because the Ace family was seen as a very, very prominent family. And he wrote this letter where he said that Rosina's children refused to leave him. And they ran behind him screaming and shouting, 3 of them, aged 13, 9, and 8 at the time. They screamed so intensely and said, we want to go live with a leader, not our mother Rosina. And so no slaves were allowed to be taken out of the Cape up to Natal. But Gideon couldn't leave these 3 children behind, Rosina's children. He said that they were beside themselves, they were screaming, they were shouting. All they wanted was to be with Alida Ace. And so he took them with him, and they went and they lived with Alida Ace, the woman who apparently Rosina said had strangled her, but yet her children left their mother behind in the Cape Colony. We know Rosina stayed behind here, and her children went and left. And I find that quite interesting. This is the final thing I'm going to share with you tonight. When women go forward and report abuse, it's very, very difficult. And we know it takes a lot of courage. And women are often victimized, and they are seen as shamed. Still today, even, you know, what is it? 2022. And the court system is not very friendly to women. I know because I've sat in court with women before. And I no longer do any form of trauma counseling or therapy or anything like that anymore. But I am involved with a lot of organizations that do. And we know that it's not easy to speak about the things that you go through when you're abused. There's a lot of shame and there's a lot of guilt. And I want to say that men are being equally as abused as women, but men don't really share their stories as easily as women do. I read an interesting statistic just last week that said only 7% of rape victims ever report their crime. That means that 93% of rape survivors never report their crime. We know that it's very, very difficult. And so when I stumbled across the earliest recorded evidence of domestic violence in Swellendam, I knew I had to share it with you. And in the book of complaints dated 1st of September 1837, there's a woman named Anna Margaretha Leroux, and she is married to Karl Kaysen. She took an oath before the officer of peace, and she said the following. This could have been written yesterday. My husband frequently leaves me alone at the house, sometimes coming home in a state of intoxication. Yesterday at about 9 o'clock in the evening, he said he was going to Flanders, his friend. I said to him that it was late and I was afraid of staying home alone. With that, he got angry, grabbed hold of me by the throat and tried to throttle me, tore all my clothes to tatters, beat me with his fist over my face, threw me onto the ground and trampled upon me. Yeah. He had a razor in his hand which I forced from him. He said that he had not yet done with me. He went out of the room exclaiming that he would go and fetch a gun to shoot me. I made my escape when he left the room and ran to my father's house. This is not the first time or second that my husband has beaten me, threatened me in this manner, and now I'm afraid that he will kill me or do to me some injury. It's very quiet in here after reading that. You know, she then asked the court, please can some security be granted so that her husband doesn't kill her? You know, it's kind of like asking for a protection order today. You know, please protect me against this man. Unfortunately, I do not know yet what happened to the case. And I do not know how this unfolded, and I'm still working on it, because like I said, what I've shared with you this evening is research that I went to get. It wasn't research that I found in a book. No one gave it to me. I had to find it. And when you find stories like this, it opens up a whole new world to realize that domestic violence, gender-based violence, or violence against women and men and children is not a new thing. It's an old thing. It's something that's been with us all the time, but how do we deal with it? And I think when I listen to Anna Margaretha Leroux, I think in my mind what it must have taken for her to come here to tell her story to the Landros as a woman, to go to any court and tell your story. Still today, honestly, it is super difficult because you are victimized. Where are your witnesses? Where are your this? Where are you that? How can we, you know, we don't really believe you. It took a lot for her to come and say this. And don't you think that this story sounds so modern? It's like it could have been written yesterday. It's the same reality that we are dealing with. So when we look at it, we go, this was happening, continues to happen, and now that it's Women's Month, what are we going to do about it? Yay! I wanted to end off, with saying that there are so many stories of women that happened in Swellendam. There was one interesting with one that was thought of to be pregnant from a slave, who actually turned out to be pregnant from a brother-in-law, and they were brought to the Drosti and imprisoned in the jail. And there's some very interesting scandalous stories that happen right here. But it's super, super interesting to consider that how many stories happened here. And also that when we walk into the old jail, we realize that there were people there with their own lives, with their own stories. Why were they there? What is the purpose for what they went through, and why did they do it? Like I said, we often judge people, but would we have done the same thing? Can we see ourselves in the people who spent time in that jail cell? Can we see that we would have risen up and committed a theft if we were oppressed? What is it that we say to ourselves, and how do we approach it? And I also want to say thank you so much. I mean, we touched the tip of the iceberg this evening, but I think it's exciting to say that though it seems unnecessary to speak about women's stories, it is completely necessary. Because like I said, and I did a TED talk on this in 2018, only 23% of all history books in the world are written about women's history. 77% of history books in the entire globe, from Asia to the UK, Europe, America, and Africa, are written about women's stories. It's important that we know about them. It's important that we can say their names, and it's important that we can look to them, because we are women and we want to leave something behind for our children and our grandchildren. And they leave something behind for us, and we can learn from them, and we can also honor them for what they did wrong that we can learn from, and also what they maybe did right that we can learn from as well. So I want to say thank you so much that I could share a little bit with you this evening. I hope that you had a good time, and yes, see you later.